History books call them merchants. In reality, the East India Company was a militarized cult of greed that makes the mafia look like a charity. They owned a private army larger than the British Empire's, minted their own cash, and officially ran the world's biggest drug cartel just to buy tea. From building a 1,500-mile wall of thorns to shipping women like cargo, here are 33 bizarre facts about the corporation that looted the world. 1. If you think modern drug cartels like the one in Breaking Bad are ruthless, they are absolute amateurs compared to the East India Company, which was officially the largest drug trafficker in the history of civilization. While they projected an image of polite, tea-sipping gentlemen in powdered wigs, their business model was identical to a violent narco-state. Because the Chinese had absolutely zero interest in buying British wool or goods, the company faced a massive trade deficit. Their villainous solution was to industrially grow vast amounts of opium in India and illegally smuggle it into China to deliberately hook the entire population. They literally created a nation of addicts just to balance their accounting books and buy affordable tea for Londoners. It was a state-sponsored international crime ring that destroyed millions of lives. Also, the British elite could enjoy a nice afternoon cuppa with a biscuit, completely ignoring the fact that their cozy ritual was funded by human misery. 2. We have all heard of the Great Wall of China, but the East India Company built something arguably much stupider and definitely pricklier, known as the Great Hedge of India. This was a literal wall of thorns, prickly pear bushes, and acacia trees that stretched for a staggering 1,500 miles across the country. That is roughly the distance from London to Constantinople, made entirely of sharp, painful plants. Why would anyone plant such a monstrous garden? Pure, unadulterated greed. The company held a strict monopoly on salt and wanted to tax every single grain consumed by the Indian population. So they grew this living green barrier to stop smugglers from moving salt without paying up. It was staffed by 12,000 customs officers who spent their entire careers watching bushes grow, proving that bureaucratic pettiness has absolutely no limits when tax revenue is on the line. 3. Real estate prices in Mumbai today are some of the most astronomical on the planet, but the East India Company pulled off the greatest property heist of all time by renting the entire island of Bombay for just 10 pounds of gold a year. In 1668, King Charles II received the islands as part of a wedding dowry from the Portuguese, but he quickly realized that managing a malaria-ridden swamp on the other side of the world was a massive administrative headache. So he leased the entire future metropolis to the company for virtually nothing. To put that in perspective, for the price of a cheap dinner or a standard Netflix subscription, the company secured a strategic deep-water port that would become the financial heart of India and their base for conquering the subcontinent. It remains the single most profitable landlord agreement in the history of capitalism. 4. If you think modern processed food is full of questionable chemicals, you should be horrified by what the East India Company was feeding the aristocracy in the 18th century. Before food safety laws existed, the British demand for tea was so high that company warehouses became notorious for selling fake tea to boost their profit margins. Unscrupulous dealers would take used tea leaves, mix them with floor sweepings, and then add a generous amount of sheep dung to increase the weight. To make this disgusting mixture look like fresh premium green tea, they dyed it with copper carbonate, which is essentially a toxic poison. So the wealthy British elite were sitting in their fancy parlors, sipping on hot toxic sheep poop, and complimenting each other on the delightful earthy flavor, completely oblivious to the fact they were drinking barnyard filth. 5. When we talk about corporate power today, we worry about tech giants influencing elections. But the East India Company was in a league of its own because it possessed a private army double the size of the official British Royal Army. At its absolute peak, this corporation commanded over 260,000 soldiers, complete with their own cavalry, artillery, and navy. Imagine if Amazon or Walmart didn't just have security guards, but actually owned their own tanks, fighter jets, and had the legal right to declare war on sovereign nations. The shareholders in London could literally vote to invade a country over breakfast if it meant improving their quarterly earnings. They were not just a trading company, they were a heavily armed military superpower, masquerading as a merchant firm, blurring the line between business and brutal warfare. 6. Take a close look at the flag of the East India Company, and you might feel a sudden confusing urge to sing the Star-Spangled Banner. Their flag featured 13 red and white horizontal stripes with a Union Jack in the top corner, which looks suspiciously identical to the Grand Union Flag, the first flag of the United States. While historians love to debate the specific details, it is highly probable that the American founding fathers, including George Washington, were inspired by the company's symbol when designing their own national identity. It is the ultimate historical irony that the American revolutionaries, who were fighting a desperate war for freedom against British tyranny, likely copied their design homework from the logo of the biggest, most ruthless corporate monopoly the world had ever seen. 7. The company faced a weird logistical problem with lonely officers stationed in India, so they came up with a dehumanizing sociological solution known as the fishing fleet. Since there were very few British women in the colonies, the company encouraged boatloads of young single women to travel from England to India specifically to hunt for husbands among the wealthy company officers. It was basically a high-stakes, real-life version of The Bachelor, but on a boat in the 19th century. The cruelty lies in what happened if they failed. If a woman did not find a husband during the season, she was sent back to England on the next ship and given the humiliating label of a returned empty. They were treated like rejected cargo simply because they didn't marry a stranger within 6 months, marking them as social failures for life. 8. The East India Company stole so much wealth, treasure, and resources from the subcontinent that they actually changed the English language in the process. The word loot did not exist in the English dictionary before the 18th century. It comes directly from the Hindi and Urdu word loot, which means to plunder, sack, or steal. The company officers were so obsessed with grabbing jewelry, gold, and art from Indian palaces that they brought the word home with them to describe their ill-gotten gains. It is incredibly fitting that a corporation built on aggressive acquisition and theft gave us the universal word for stealing stuff. Every time you hear a gamer talk about loot boxes or looting a village, they are unknowingly referencing the dark legacy of British corporate greed from 200 years ago. 9. Robert Clive is usually remembered as the ruthless mastermind behind British India, but the entire empire almost ended before it began because of a cheap, faulty pistol. As a deeply depressed young clerk stuck in a boring desk job in Madras, Clive tried to commit suicide not once but twice on the same afternoon. He put a loaded pistol to his head and pulled the trigger, but the gun inexplicably jammed. Confused, he checked the mechanism, saw it was primed perfectly, put it back to his temple and pulled the trigger again, only for it to jam a second time. When he fired it out the window a moment later to test it, the gun worked perfectly. Instead of taking this as a sign to seek therapy or buy a better gun, Clive decided he was practically immortal and destined for greatness by the universe. He went on to become a sociopathic conqueror, proving that a manufacturing defect changed the fate of millions of people. 10. You might enjoy a refreshing gin and tonic on a Friday night, but this classic cocktail was actually invented by the East India Company as a disgusting medical necessity for survival. British soldiers in India were dropping like flies from malaria, and the only known cure at the time was quinine, a powder derived from the bark of the cinchona tree that tasted absolutely vile, so bitter that it would make grown men vomit. To get the stubborn troops to actually drink their life-saving medicine without gagging, the officers started mixing the powder with sugar, lime, water, and their daily ration of gin to mask the awful flavor. So, the G&T was literally created as a pharmaceutical delivery system to keep the army alive. It is the only time in history where getting day drunk was officially prescribed by doctors as a responsible health and safety measure against tropical disease. 11. When Napoleon Bonaparte was finally defeated at Waterloo, the British government had a serious problem with where to put him, so they essentially rented a prison cell from a corporation. Napoleon was exiled to St. Helena, a tiny, desolate rock in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, which was actually the private property of the East India Company. The company was responsible for supplying the island, managing the logistics, and technically acting as the jailers for the most dangerous man in Europe. It is a bizarre historical reality that the former Emperor of France, who once lived in the golden palaces of Versailles and ruled nearly all of Europe, spent his final miserable years living as a tenant on corporate real estate, effectively being guarded by glorified Amazon delivery drivers with muskets who were constantly worried about their quarterly security budget. 12. We are used to modern companies having strict HR policies, but the East India Company had its own sovereign laws that superseded actual nations. Despite just being a group of London merchants, they minted their own currency stamped with the company crest, established their own supreme courts to judge locals, and had the legal authority to execute people. They even granted passports to travelers, effectively acting as a border control agency. It created a terrifying legal gray zone where a profit-seeking board of directors acted as the king, the judge, and the executioner all at once. If you committed a crime in their territory, you weren't judged by the impartial laws of England or India, but by the corporate bylaws of a business, meaning your life or death depended entirely on whether hanging you was good for the shareholders' profits. 13. The British are famous for refusing to adapt to local weather, but the East India Company took this to a suicidal level with their ridiculous military dress code. Despite operating in the scorching, humid tropical heat of India, where temperatures regularly hit 40 degrees Celsius, the company insisted that their soldiers wear the traditional heavy red wool coats designed for European winters. The logic was purely about branding and looking proper rather than survival. Soldiers would frequently pass out from heat stroke, foam at the mouth, or die of dehydration during long marches because their commanders thought it was more important to look smart in wool than to stay alive in cotton. It is the perfect example of corporate stubbornness, where they literally cooked their own employees to death inside their uniforms just to maintain a consistent brand image. 14. For a company run by staunch Christians who publicly looked down on pagan religions, the East India Company had absolutely no moral compass when it came to making money from them. For years, the company officially took over the management of the famous Jagannath Temple in Puri, not to destroy it or convert people, but to act as profitable church wardens. They organized the religious festivals, maintained the idol of the Hindu god, and aggressively collected the pilgrim tax from worshippers. It reached a point of total absurdity where British Christian officers were essentially working as paid temple administrators for a Hindu deity, ensuring the rituals ran on time. It proves that for the East India Company, the only god they truly worshipped was the gold coin, and they didn't care whose altar it came from as long as they got a cut. 15. Americans are taught that the Boston Tea Party was a rebellion against the king's taxes, but it was actually a violent protest against a corporate bailout of the East India Company. The company was on the verge of bankruptcy because they had millions of pounds of unsold tea rotting in their London warehouses due to mismanagement. To save them, the British government passed the Tea Act, allowing the company to dump this surplus tea on the American colonies at a bargain price, undercutting local merchants and smugglers. So, when the Sons of Liberty threw those crates into the harbor, they weren't just fighting taxation without representation. They were destroying the inventory of a failing monopoly that had been given a special government handout. The American Revolution was basically sparked by a rejected corporate liquidation sale that threatened local small businesses. 16. Robert Clive was a controversial figure who died young, but his pet tortoise, Adwaita, turned out to be the ultimate historical survivor. Clive captured the Aldabra giant tortoise in the Seychelles and kept it as a pet in his garden in India around 1757. While the East India Company rose to absolute power, looted a continent, caused massive famines, collapsed, and eventually dissolved, Adwaita just kept eating lettuce in the garden. This tortoise allegedly lived for around 250 years, finally passing away in a Kolkata zoo in the year 2006. That means this single animal was alive before the American Revolution, lived through 2 world wars, and survived long enough to see the invention of the internet, outliving the entire British Empire by several human generations. 17. During the First Opium War, the Chinese military was initially confident because they had centuries of naval experience. But the East India Company unveiled a secret weapon that changed warfare forever: the Nemesis. It was the first British ocean-going iron warship, and when it arrived in China, it was like an alien spaceship landing in medieval times. The Chinese junk ships were made of wood and dependent on the wind, while the Nemesis was made of metal, powered by steam, and didn't care about the weather. It literally ran over the Chinese boats, crushing them like matchsticks, and blew the rest out of the water with heavy cannons. It wasn't a battle, it was a massacre. This was the terrifying moment the company proved that industrial technology could bully an entire ancient civilization into submission just to force them to buy illegal drugs. 18. When you think of Yale University, you probably think of Ivy League prestige, smart people, and secret societies. But the university is actually named after Elihu Yale, a man who made his massive fortune as a corrupt official for the East India Company. Yale started as a low-level clerk but eventually worked his way up to become the governor of Madras, where he engaged in illegal private trading and arguably profited from the slave trade to line his own pockets. He was so notoriously corrupt that he was eventually fired by the company. However, he took his blood money back to the West and donated a bunch of books and goods to a struggling college in Connecticut. They were so desperate for cash they named the school after him. So, one of America's most prestigious universities was effectively funded by the stolen loot of a colonial crook. 19. Modern corporations get a lot of hate for caring only about shareholders, but the East India Company invented that mindset and took it to a sociopathic extreme. No matter what was happening in India, whether it was a devastating war, a plague, or a famine killing millions of people, the directors in London had one single obsession: the annual dividend. For years, they maintained a guaranteed payout of around 10% to their wealthy investors, regardless of the human cost. During the Great Bengal Famine of 1770, where 10 million people starved to death, the company actually increased tax collection to ensure the shareholders back home didn't lose a penny. It is a chilling reminder that for the EIC, human lives were just abstract numbers on a spreadsheet, and the profit margin always, without exception, came first. 20. Sir Stamford Raffles is celebrated today as the visionary founder of Singapore, but the story of how he got it is hilarious because he basically went rogue and ignored his bosses. The company directors in London specifically told him not to annoy the Dutch or acquire more territory because it was too expensive to manage. Raffles completely ignored them. He found a local sultan involved in a messy succession dispute, recognized him as the true ruler, and quickly signed a treaty to buy the island of Singapore for the company. When London found out, they were furious and wanted to fire him for disobedience. But by the time the slow mail arrived, Singapore was already making a fortune as a trading post. It proves that in the company, you could break every rule in the book as long as you made a profit by the end of the fiscal year. 21. The East India Company had a massive problem with pirates raiding their treasure ships, so they decided to hire a privateer to hunt them down. They chose a man named William Kidd, gave him a ship, and sent him off to clean up the Indian Ocean. This turned out to be one of the worst hiring decisions in corporate history. Once Captain Kidd got out to sea, he realized that hunting pirates was hard, dangerous work, but robbing ships himself was actually quite fun and profitable. So, instead of stopping the pirates, he joined them and became one of the most notorious pirates of all time. The company effectively funded the startup costs for the very criminal they were trying to catch. It would be like the FBI hiring a bank robber to guard a vault, and then acting surprised when the vault ends up empty. 22. You would assume that a British organization in the 1800s would be obsessed with spreading Christianity, but for a long time, the East India Company strictly banned missionaries from entering their territory. This wasn't because they were tolerant or open-minded, it was purely because they were terrified that angry priests trying to convert Hindus and Muslims would cause riots and hurt their bottom line. They famously stated that they would rather have a stable prophet than a saved soul. They deported priests and refused to let them on their ships. It is a rare moment in history where corporate greed actually enforced a strange kind of secularism, simply because religious conflict was considered a bad user experience for the business model of exploiting the locals. 23. The Koh-i-Noor diamond is the crown jewel of the British monarchy, sitting in the Tower of London today. But the story of how the company got it is like a scene from a bullying movie. After conquering the Punjab region, the company forced the ruler to sign a treaty handing over the diamond to Queen Victoria. The problem? The ruler was Duleep Singh, a frightened 10-year-old boy. The company officials separated this child from his mother, surrounded him with intimidating soldiers and diplomats, and coerced him into signing away his kingdom and his family's greatest treasure. They didn't win the diamond in a battle or buy it. They basically mugged a fourth grader for his lunch money, except the lunch money was the most valuable gem on earth and a symbol of his nation's sovereignty. 24. The East India Company grew so incredibly large that they couldn't just hire random people anymore. They needed a steady stream of professional administrators to run an empire. So they built their own private college in England called Haileybury. It was basically Hogwarts for colonial bureaucrats. Young men, usually from wealthy families, were sent there to learn Indian languages, law, and how to be a proper ruler before being shipped off to govern a district in India. It was an entire educational institution designed solely to churn out corporate middle managers for a governing machine. If you ever wonder how the British maintained such a stiff upper lip, it's because they went to a boarding school specifically designed to teach them how to repress their emotions and collect taxes efficiently. 25. We tend to think of the East India Company as tea merchants, but their true power lay in their absolute monopoly on violence through the control of saltpeter. Saltpeter is the key ingredient in gunpowder, and the best quality supply in the world was found in the soil of Bengal, which the company owned. This meant that for decades they essentially decided who in Europe was allowed to shoot a gun. During the Napoleonic Wars, while Britain was fighting for its life against France, the company was the one supplying the gunpowder to the British Army. At a nice profit, of course. They had such a stranglehold on the market that European kings and generals had to stay on good terms with a board of corporate directors in London just to ensure their armies didn't run out of ammo in the middle of a battle. 26. The company was so dominant that they didn't just control the land, they effectively decided what time it was. Before standard time zones existed, every city had its own local time based on the sun. But to coordinate their massive railway network and military logistics across the subcontinent, the company established Madras time based on their observatory in the city of Madras. For decades, this corporate clock was the official time for the railway system, meaning that millions of people were living their lives according to a schedule set by a trading firm. It is a level of control that modern tech companies can only dream of. Imagine if Google or Apple simply decided to shift the world's clocks by 30 minutes to make their shipping logistics slightly more efficient, and everyone just had to accept it. 27. The East India Company didn't just buy products, they engaged in the world's most audacious corporate espionage to steal them. The most famous example is tea. For centuries, China held the secret of tea production and refused to sell the seeds. So, the company hired a botanist named Robert Fortune to go undercover. He shaved his head, wore a fake ponytail, dressed in Chinese robes, and infiltrated the forbidden tea regions of China. He literally stole thousands of tea plants and seeds, smuggling them out to India to start the company's own plantations in the Himalayas. It was the 19th century equivalent of stealing the secret formula for Coca-Cola, except they stole an entire agricultural industry and destroyed China's economy in the process, all to avoid paying market price.